Mother called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was eating lunch at my desk to tell me she wouldn't be coming to my wedding. She didn't lead with that. She never does. She started with the weather. How cold it had been in Sudbury, how the driveway needed salting, how my father's knee was acting up again. Then, somewhere between the weather and the knee, she slipped it in. We've been thinking a new brother ceremony is the same weekend, and the drive to Toronto is a lot for us, and you know how Daniel gets anxious when plans change last minute. She paused. You understand, don't you? You've always been the sensible one. I set down my fork. I looked at the wall of my apartment. I said, of course, I understand. She sounded relieved. Genuinely relieved, like she'd been holding her breath waiting for me to make things easier for her. Which of course I did. I always did. I didn't cry until after I hung up. And even then it was quiet. The kind of crying you do in a bathroom with the fan on so your coworkers don't hear you through the wall. Have you ever been told that your feelings are a scheduling conflict? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. My name is Claire. I'm 32 years old, and for most of my life, I was the family's contingency plan. The one you called when things went wrong, the one who showed up, who didn't need anything, who was so low maintenance. My parents said that like it was a compliment. It took me a long time to understand it was just a different way of saying I didn't cost them anything, so I didn't register. My brother Daniel is 4 years older than me. Growing up, he was the one with the learning struggles, the anxiety, the meltdowns at the grocery store that my mother would describe in exhausted detail to every relative who asked. I understood, even as a kid, that he needed more. I genuinely didn't resent him for it. What I resented, slowly, quietly, the way water erodes stone, was that needing more became deserving more. Needing more became the whole story. And I became the background. When I was 17 and got into the co-op accounting program at my high school, my parents forgot to tell the extended family. When Daniel completed a community college certificate in hospitality 2 years later, my grandmother threw him a dinner party. There were balloons. I moved to Toronto at 22 for work. My father helped Daniel buy a condo in Sudbury at 26, a down payment pulled from the savings account they'd been building since he was a teenager, the one they told me about once, offhand, as if I already knew. As if I had one too. I didn't ask. I already knew the answer, and some questions aren't worth the damage they do on the way out. I build my own life. I'm a senior accountant at a mid-size firm in the financial district. I have a studio that I upgraded to a one-bedroom when I got my last promotion. I have a partner named Marcus, who was a project manager at a construction company and the most grounded person I've ever met, and who, when I told him about the Tuesday phone call, put down what he was doing and said, okay, tell me everything. Not it'll be fine. Not, I'm sure she didn't mean it that way. Just, tell me everything. That's who he is. We'd been planning our wedding for 8 months. Small, intentional. 40 people at a restored farmhouse venue about an hour outside the city, near Barrie. We put down a deposit. We picked a date. I had told my family the date 9 months before we booked anything, specifically to avoid conflicts. My mother had said, oh, that's lovely. We'll be there. Daniel set his wedding date 4 weeks after that conversation. Same weekend, different city. His was up in Sudbury, at a banquet hall attached to a hotel. But same Friday to Sunday block. My parents told me later they hadn't realized. I didn't say what I was thinking, which was, you realized. You just decided. The call started about 6 weeks before my wedding. Not from my mother this time, from Daniel. Which was unusual, because Daniel and I didn't have that kind of relationship. We were polite at Christmas. We texted on birthdays. That was the whole of it. The first call came at 7 in the morning on a Saturday. I was still in bed. Marcus answered my phone because he thought it might be the venue. We'd had a question outstanding about table rentals. He handed it to me with a look that said, it's your brother. I need you to call the hotel block and sort out the room list, Daniel said. No hello. My fiancé is overwhelmed and I don't have time for this right now. I sat up. Good morning, Daniel. Claire, I'm serious. The block expires Thursday. Can you just handle it? I have my own wedding in 6 weeks, I said. Yours is smaller. This is 45 rooms. Just make the calls. I didn't make the calls. I said I'd look into it, which I knew he'd take as a yes, and then I didn't do it and didn't respond when he followed up. It wasn't graceful, but it was what I had. The boundary didn't hold. It never does when your parents are the enforcement mechanism. My mother called 2 days later. The same apologetic but firm voice she'd used my whole life when she wanted me to do something I didn't want to do. "He's really stressed, Claire. The hotel is being difficult, and his fiance's family doesn't know anyone up there, and he just needs someone organized to step in. You're so good at this stuff." "I'm also planning a wedding," I said. "Yours is so small, though," she said. And then, before I could respond, "I'm not saying it doesn't matter, I'm just saying you have the capacity. Daniel doesn't." I thought about that sentence for a long time afterward. "You have the capacity." She meant it as a compliment. She had no idea it was a map of everything she'd ever taken from me. I told her I'd think about it. I hung up. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at the spreadsheet I'd built for our wedding. Vendors, timelines, deposits, contacts, and I felt something shift in me. Not rage. Colder than that. I opened a different folder on my laptop. One I'd been professionally obligated not to discuss with my family, and which, until that moment, had simply been a work matter. It had nothing to do with my personal life. Those are supposed to be separate things, except that they weren't anymore. Because my brother worked at the same company where I had just been retained as an external engagement lead. I should explain. My firm had been brought in to assist with a financial review of a regional hospitality group, a small chain of hotel properties and event venues in Northern Ontario. The engagement had come through a referral, and I'd been assigned as the file lead 3 months earlier. I'd signed the usual NDAs. I'd done the usual background review. I had not, until that phone call with my mother, connected the name of the company to the banquet hall where my brother was getting married, because I genuinely hadn't known where he was holding the event. The name on the file was the parent company. The venue was a subsidiary. The dots connected slowly, over 2 days, and when they did, I sat very still for a long time. My brother was the director of events and catering at that property. I was the person the ownership group had hired to find out why their catering revenue numbers hadn't matched their operational costs for the past 2 years. I didn't tell my family any of this. I was not permitted to. I called my engagement partner at the firm, disclosed the personal connection, and asked for guidance on whether I needed to recuse. She reviewed it, consulted with our ethics advisor, and confirmed that because the review was of the financial systems and not of any individual employee, and because I had no prior knowledge of the connection when I accepted the file, I could remain on the engagement provided I documented the disclosure and had a second reviewer shadow my work on any findings that touched his department. Standard protocol. I documented everything. I continued the file. I want to be clear about something. I did not use that file to go after my brother. I did not go looking for problems in his department specifically. I was doing what I was hired to do, following the numbers. It's just that the numbers kept leading back to the same place. The discrepancy wasn't sophisticated. That's what surprised me most. It wasn't buried. It was sloppy, the kind of sloppy that happens when someone has been getting away with something small for long enough that they stop being careful. Event packages being invoiced at full price with partial delivery. Supplier invoices for linen rentals and floral arrangements from a company I couldn't find any public registration for. Expense reimbursements submitted and approved on the same day in a workflow that should have required a secondary approval from a different manager. That approval had been bypassed because the secondary approval manager was a part-time hire who had been quietly reclassified as a contractor the previous year, a reclassification that had been recommended, in writing, by my brother. The amount wasn't $400,000. It was closer to $85,000 over 22 months. In Canada, that's still Section 380 of the Criminal Code. That's fraud over $5,000. That's a federal charge. I documented everything. I submitted my preliminary findings to the engagement partner. She reviewed them, brought in a second senior accountant to verify, and we prepared the summary for the ownership group. This is normal. This is how it works. You find something, you report it to the client decides what to do with it. The ownership group decided to bring in outside legal counsel and present the findings at their quarterly board meeting. They asked if I would attend to present the financial summary. I said yes. I noted, again in writing, that I had a personal connection to one of the individuals whose department was flagged, and confirmed that my findings had been independently verified. Everything was documented. The board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday, 12 days before my wedding, 9 days before my brother's. I didn't tell Marcus the full details until the night before, not because I didn't trust him, but because I genuinely didn't know how it would go, and I didn't want to hand him a version of events that might not be the version that happened. When I told him, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you need me to come?" "It's a client meeting," I said. "I know what it is," he said. "Do you need me to come?" I said no. I could handle it. I wore my navy blazer and the small pearl earrings my grandmother had given me when I graduated. I took the subway to the meeting. I walked into the boardroom and set up my laptop and did not think about my brother or my mother or the Tuesday phone call or the balloons at Daniel's graduation party. I thought about the file. I presented the findings. I answered questions. I was precise and I was calm, and I cited every document by tab number, and I did not raise my voice once. The ownership group thanked me. Legal counsel confirmed they would be pursuing the matter. HR was notified. My role in it was, professionally, complete. I took the subway home. I picked up butter chicken from the place near our apartment that Marcus likes. I set the table. When he came home from work, we ate dinner and he told me about a drainage issue on his site, and I told him about a podcast I'd been listening to. And we didn't talk about the meeting. Not because there was anything to hide, just because it was done and we were home and the food was warm and some things you finish and then you close the folder. What I didn't know, what I found out later, was that my parents had been planning to contribute to Daniel's wedding costs. Not a small amount. They had refinanced. In Ontario, that's legal and common enough. But what they'd done specifically was take a secured line of credit against the equity in their house in Sudbury, a house they'd owned outright since my father paid off the mortgage 6 years ago. They'd accessed a significant sum to fund a wedding venue that was, at the moment they signed that paperwork, under active financial review. The venue had not disclosed this to its clients. That would become its own legal problem later, and not mine to solve. But I thought about my parents. Their paid-off house, the line of credit, the balloon payment that would come due, and I felt that cold nausea again. They had bet their security on a version of Daniel that had never existed. They had handed him the keys and told him he was going somewhere, and he had driven straight into a wall. I called my mother 2 days after the board meeting. I didn't tell her what I'd found. I didn't have permission to, and it wouldn't have mattered. She wouldn't have believed me. I asked her instead about the line of credit. I asked if she and my father had considered what would happen if the venue had financial difficulties. She laughed. "Claire, you worry too much. That's always been your thing." "I know," I said. "I just want you to be okay." There was a pause. Then softly, and this is the part I've thought about the most, she said, "You're such a good kid. You know that." It was the first time she'd said anything like that in years. Maybe longer. I said, "I know, Mom." And I meant it kindly. I really did. My wedding was on a Saturday. We drove up to the venue the day before to do the final walkthrough, and Marcus held my hand in the car, and we listened to the playlist we'd made for the drive and stopped for coffee and berry at a place we'd been meaning to try. The venue was everything we'd wanted. Old wood and high ceilings and strings of Edison lights that the owner had put up that afternoon. Marcus cried a little during the vows. So did I. My best friend from university gave a speech that was genuinely funny and genuinely true. We danced until the venue's end time and then stood in the gravel parking lot in the cold November air and said goodbye to the last of our guests. And I looked at this man I'd married, and I thought, I built this. We built this. Nobody handed it to us, and nobody can take it back. My parents were in Sudbury. I already knew that. I had made peace with it in the weeks before. Not happily, not completely, but enough to let the day be the day. You can hold grief and gratitude at the same time. They don't cancel each other out. Daniel's wedding did not go the way my parents had planned. The venue's board had informed the events calendar that the property would be undergoing a management transition effective immediately following the current booking cycle. Daniel's wedding was in the final weekend of that cycle. The event itself proceeded. The guests were there, the food was served, the DJ played his playlist. But the property's director of events was not in attendance because by that point he had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. His absence was explained to guests as a sudden illness. His fiancée and I genuinely fell for her. She hadn't done anything wrong, found out about the investigation the week before the wedding, when legal counsel attempted to reach Daniel at the venue and called the wrong number. She called off the engagement 2 days after the reception. I heard this from my aunt, not from my parents. The legal process took most of the following year. Daniel ultimately pleaded guilty to a single count of fraud over $5,000 and received a conditional sentence. No jail time, but a criminal record, restitution, and a prohibition from working in financial management roles for 5 years. His lawyer negotiated well. The outcome was fair, I think. in the way that outcomes usually are when someone with no prior record and a good lawyer cooperates early. My parents spent 6 months believing I had done this to him. My mother didn't call for 3 months. When she did, her voice had something in it I hadn't heard before. Not warmth, exactly, but something thinner and more honest. Something that sounded like she was tired of being certain. "I need to understand what happened," she said. I told her. Slowly, clearly, without editorializing. I told her about the disclosure I'd filed, the independent review, the documented findings. I told her it wasn't personal, and that the most honest thing I could say was that I'd done my job and that my job had found what it found. She was quiet for a long time. "Then, you could have told us." "I wasn't allowed to," I said, "and it wouldn't have changed the numbers." Another pause. "He's your brother." "I know he is," I said. "I didn't find the problem because he's my brother. I found it because it was there." She didn't have an answer for that. I hadn't expected one. Some things you don't resolve in a phone call. Some things take years or never fully close. I've made peace with that too. Not because I don't care, but because I've learned the difference between a door that's closed and a wall. You can knock on a door. A wall you just eventually stop standing in front of. Marcus and I bought a place last spring, a semi in the east end of the city, close to a park, with a backyard that needs work. We've been doing most of it ourselves on weekends. His brother comes sometimes to help with the heavier stuff. My best friend came last August and we planted a garden together, and it didn't really take, but we're trying again this year. It's a good life. It's a life that nobody gave me. My parents still live in Sudbury. The line of credit is still live in Sudbury. The line of credit is still outstanding. They'll be paying it for years. My father's knee is better. My mother and I talk every few weeks now, and it's careful, the way things are when you're rebuilding something after it's been damaged. Not the same as before. Maybe better, in some small ways. More honest, less performed. I don't know yet. We're still in the middle of it. What I know is this. For most of my life, I made myself small, because I thought that was what love required. I thought being easy, being quiet, being the sensible one, was how you earned your place. It isn't. It never was. Your place is not something you earn. It's something you make, with your own hands, on your own timeline with the people who show up for you. Really show up, not just when it's convenient. I made myself a home. I made myself a marriage. I made myself a career I'm proud of, doing work that is hard and precise, and occasionally, quietly, matters. My mother forgot to come to my wedding. My brother tried to use me and got caught by the work I was already doing. And I am, for the first time in my life, completely unbothered by both of those things. That's not a small ending. For me, it's the whole point. There's a moment I keep coming back to. Not the boardroom, not the wedding, not even the phone call where my mother told me she wouldn't be there. It's a smaller moment than any of those. It's me, 17 years old, watching my brother drive away in a car my parents bought him, doing the math in my head about whether I could afford a used textbook. That's the moment everything actually started. Not the betrayal. The arithmetic. The quiet decision I made, without fully knowing I was making it, to never be in a position where someone else's choices determined whether I was okay. I think about what it actually took to get from that driveway in Sudbury to where I am now. And it wasn't one thing. It was three things, working together slowly over years. The way roots work, underground, invisible, until one day there's a tree. The first was integrity, not the word on a poster kind. The kind that costs something. When I found what I found on that file, Daniel's name, his department, the numbers that didn't add up, I had every reason to look the other way. He was my brother. My parents already thought I was the difficult one. I could have flagged a conflict of interest and walked away clean. Instead, I documented everything, disclosed the personal connection in writing, had my work independently verified, and presented the findings to the client the same way I would have for any other file. That's not heroism. That's just doing your job when it's inconvenient. But I think it matters. Maybe more than anything else, that you are the same person whether or not anyone is watching. The second was judgment. Not cleverness, not strategy. Just the willingness to look clearly at a situation and understand what it actually is, not what you want it to be. My parents looked at Daniel and saw an investment. I looked at the same person and saw a pattern. Neither of us was being cruel, but only one of us was being accurate. Clear thinking protected me in ways that loyalty never could have. It's the thing that let me do my work well, make the right call, and still sleep. The third, and this one is harder to name because it looks like stubbornness from the outside, is the refusal to stop. Every time I was told I was too small, too boring, too low maintenance to matter, I could have agreed. I almost did, sometimes. But I kept going anyway. I kept building the career, kept saving, kept showing up for the work, even when the work was hard, and nobody in my family noticed or cared. That persistence wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It just kept moving forward. One envelope, one file, one Tuesday at a time. What happened to Daniel was the result of his own choices, accumulated over years. I didn't cause it. I just happened to be the person holding the flashlight when the room got dark. And what happened to me? The marriage, the house, the life that actually fits? That's also the result of choices, accumulated over years. Mine. Marcus and I were planting the garden again last weekend, the one that didn't take last summer. He was reading the seed packet instructions out loud with great seriousness, like they were legal documents. I was laughing. The sun was out. It was a completely ordinary Saturday. I used to think I was waiting for someone to finally see me clearly and decide I was worth something. I don't wait for that anymore. I already know what I built. I was there for all of it.